So since I started testing Fuji cameras this year, I've been getting a lot of comments and messages asking me to review the X100F. And I've been wanting to get this camera for a while, even before I started getting messages about it. But I've been also kind of debating if I should get it or not, because I hear the new one's coming sometime later this year, and also this thing isn't exactly cheap. It's like $1,200, and compared to cameras like the Fuji X-T2 or the X-T30, or even like the Ricoh GR3 that I tested a few weeks ago, which I complained that was too expensive, this camera makes them sound like a bargain now. And for a 2.5-year-old camera, even the used ones seem to be holding on to their value really well. And I've been searching on eBay for weeks, and it was really hard to find one that was under like $900. And I didn't want to rent one because, you know, I wanted to keep the camera around for at least a few weeks and actually use it before I give it a fair review. Especially when the camera's been out for 2.5 years. I know a lot of people who are going to be watching this video probably already own this camera, so I just wanted to use this camera really like my own, which it is now, and instead of renting one. And after a few weeks I would have spent like a few $100s on rental anyway, so I decided to buy a used one. But if you think about it, the X-T2 might be technically a better camera, at least on paper, because it has things like dual card slots, weather sealing, and also slightly better autofocusing, and it can shoot at higher frame rates, and it's also a lot better for video. But in terms of image quality, this has exactly the same sensor that goes inside the X-T2, and the 23mm f2 lens that's attached to it, which is probably my favorite Fuji lens for street photography. So it is kind of priced like the used X-T2 plus a 23mm f2 lens. So when you think about it that way, it's actually not too bad. So for those of you who are new to this camera, let me just go over some of the basic features and specs of the camera real quick. So like I just mentioned, it has the same sensor as the X-T2. It's a 24 megapixel X-Trans APS-C sensor, which is a great news, obviously, because the X-T2 sensor was great and it performed great, and the color was amazing, and in low light, as long as you stayed under 6400 ISO, or if you're really picky, 3200, the images will be generally pretty clean, and the dynamic range is great. I didn't really notice this when I was testing the X-T2, but it seems like the camera slightly favors the shadows more than the highlights. So like the amount of details you could pull out from the shadows was really amazing. And at least for street photography, I generally like to slightly underexpose my photos intentionally, just to give it a little more moody atmosphere. So that's a great news for me. And it has a 23mm f2 lens, which I also have right here. So Fuji somehow made this lens into this little pancake, and I don't know why they couldn't do this with this thing, but you know, they seem to perform almost identically. The image quality seemed to be virtually identical. I've tested this lens a lot in the past few months, and I've also watched a lot of reviews of this lens. Some reviewers mentioned that it is a bit soft at f2 at wide open. I never really noticed it. Like when it comes to judging a camera lens or a camera, surprisingly, sharpness is pretty low down on my list. So like, as long as everything is in focus, it's usually good enough for me. And also for street photography, I'm usually somewhere in between f4 and f8 anyway, so the sharpness at f2 doesn't really matter to me. And also in my X-T2 low light testing video, all the photos in that video were taken with this lens at f2 in between ISO 3200 and 6400. And even after YouTube compression at 1080, a lot of people commented that the images were quite sharp. So if you're curious, just go check out that video and see for yourself. Oh, and also speaking of shooting wide open, this camera also has a built-in ND filter, which is great for when you want to shoot wide open on bright sunny days, and which will be useful because the maximum shutter speed on this camera is 4000. And the autofocus was good. just like the X-T2, it does hunt around a little bit in low light, and I kind of wish I got this camera before I got my X-T3, because coming straight from the X-T3, it does feel a little slower, and the X-T3 just seems to grab focus quicker and also a lot better in low light, and it seems to be able to hold on to its subjects a lot better while tracking. But if you don't have an X-T3 to compare this with side by side, you're probably not going to notice any issues. It also has the famous Fuji dials at the top like the X-T3. I guess the styling of the dials are more similar to cameras like the X Pro 2. Instead of having a dedicated dial for ISO, now the ISO dial and shutter speed dial are combined into one. It also lacks the physical switches for the metering mode and the drive mode like on the X-T3. So it took me some time getting used to that, but after a while I really didn't mind the layout at all. And some people don't seem to like the ISO dial, and it does take a little longer to change ISO compared to the dial on my X-T3 because you don't see all the numbers at once. But for street photography, it's probably easier to just use the auto ISO anyway. And the funny thing about the auto ISO on this camera that I noticed, when you're in continuous autofocus mode, apparently the screen does not display the correct ISO that you're at. So just like any other Fuji cameras, there are ways to set up 3 different auto ISO settings. So you can set your minimum ISO and your maximum ISO, and the camera would always stay in between those. But when you're in auto ISO and continuous autofocus mode, for some reason, the back screen always just displays the maximum ISO. So for example, right now it says ISO A1 3200, which is my maximum ISO setting at A1 setting, and it does not change when I focus on different stuff, and even when I'm looking directly into my light, it still says 3200. So on the first few days I thought there was something wrong with the camera, so I just took it out of auto ISO and used it at ISO 200 pretty much all day, and it was a pretty sunny day, so it didn't really matter, and I guess it was kind of like shooting film. And I looked it up online, and apparently this was just a little bug that was never fixed, which is pretty weird for Fuji, I guess. And once you take a photo and when you preview the picture, it will show you the correct ISO setting that it was at when it took the picture. So far, I've had no major complaints about the placement of the dials and buttons. And you know, I normally complain about smaller cameras a lot, but I think I've been just getting slowly used to smaller cameras while using my X-T3. And you know, like I said, you don't really buy something like this for its ergonomics, and I think I just started to accept them as what they are. And after a while, you get used to the layout and you'll be fine. And it doesn't have the flippy touchscreen like on the X-T3, which I did miss sometimes, but you know, it's really not a deal breaker. And the screen itself, I think, is good enough so you can still see things at various angles. I did hear a rumor though that the new X Pro 3, which is also coming out this year, will have a tilty touchscreen, and I'm guessing they're gonna use the similar screen on the X100V, but we'll have to see. A lot of people also seem to complain about the placement of the tripod mount. It's really close to the battery compartment, so if you have a tripod mount attached to it, you won't be able to open the battery compartment. I don't know why Fuji didn't align that with the lens more on the left side, but you know, I feel like I don't think this is a camera that you would mount on your tripod a lot. Maybe that's just me. And unless you're a video shooter, or unless you're going to be shooting lots of time lapses with this, like I don't know how often you're going to be changing batteries while it's on a tripod. I'm not sure, but that's completely up to you. And last but not least, perhaps the biggest feature on this camera is probably its viewfinder. This is a rangefinder style hybrid optical and electronic viewfinder, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons what makes this camera so special and unique. And this isn't the first of its kind. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the 3rd generation of the X100 cameras, and Fuji also makes cameras like the X Pro series. And I can't really comment about those cameras because I've never used them, but from what I hear, when it comes to these rangefinder style viewfinders, the X100F has the latest and greatest that Fuji has ever made. And it is quite an interesting experience, and I guess it's not that different from what you would see on a DSLR. It still displays a lot of information on the screen, even though when you're looking out directly into the world. And just because of the nature of it being a rangefinder style camera, the frame that you're going to see on the viewfinder will never be exactly the same as the actual picture that you're going to take. But what makes the viewfinder really cool is that with a flick of a switch, you can switch it to an electronic viewfinder. There's something always very nice about using an optical viewfinder, and I first noticed this when I went to the EOS R from my 5D Mark IV, and most of their mirrorless cameras actually, and even on really nice electronic viewfinders, there's always that bit of there's always that sense of disconnect from your subject to yourself. It's very difficult to explain what it is, but like imagine that you replaced all your windows at your house with an LCD screen, or imagine the front windscreen was a giant monitor in your car. You know, technically they might have a lot of benefits, but you know, it's just not the same as being able to see the world with your own eyes rather than through an LCD screen. So I think it's just really cool that on this camera you have the option to easily switch between the two whenever you want. And the electronic viewfinder is not bad either, and it's slightly smaller than the ones on the X-T2 and the X-T3, and I think the frame rate is a little slower, but I only noticed the difference when I'm trying it side by side with my X-T3, and when I'm just using this normally, it never bothered me at all. And also, more importantly, I think this camera just looks really cool. I mean, I don't know how Fuji does this, but like they always seem to have the perfect blend of old and new. It looks like an old camera, but not in like a fake pretentious hipstery kind of way. And whoever's designing all the Fuji cameras nowadays, big respect to you, and I'm a huge fan. It is such a great looking camera, but it also has that understated look to it, so when most people saw you with this camera, they wouldn't take you too seriously, which is a great thing if you're a street photographer. But for other photographers or for people who know cameras, if they saw you with this camera, this is the camera that will make them go, this guy knows what he's doing. This might be a bad analogy, but I'm gonna use it anyway. This is like a Golf GTI of cameras. It's such a classic design, and for people who know cars, it's a cool car, but for most people, it's just a Golf. And you might think that's just a joke, but it's such a big deal with street photography. And that's something you just cannot see from some numbers on the spec sheet. Because when you're doing street photography or when you're traveling, sometimes you may end up in some not so safe neighborhoods, and driving into those neighborhoods in a $100,000 sports car compared to in a Golf GTI, you know, people react differently to you. And you know, I'm just learning this recently too as a longtime DSLR shooter, but you know, people just seem to act differently, and people just seem a lot less intimidated by smaller cameras like this. And you may or may not notice this at the time when you're taking pictures, but the people in the photos just seem a lot more natural and candid and more comfortable. And I think that also makes me more comfortable and more confident in taking strangers' pictures. And for those of you who've been following me for a while, you know, I'm not exactly a camera personality. I don't like talking to people. I don't like talking to strangers. I'm mostly an introverted guy. And I'm not over exaggerating this, but I feel like in just the past few weeks, I've become a better street photographer because of this camera. And I feel like that's one of the biggest compliments that a camera reviewer can give to a camera. And a lot of people might say that the biggest feature on the camera is the viewfinder or the lens or the form factor or the design. But based on my experience, I think in a sentence, this camera is the camera that will make you want to take more photos and also make you a better photographer because of it. And this is the camera that you should take with you everywhere. And even compared to cameras like the GR3, I think after a few weeks of testing this camera, I think I can tell you safely that I like this camera a lot more than the GR3. I mean, the GR3 is obviously a great camera, but I think I do still prefer the 35mm focal length, and the addition of the viewfinder is a world of difference to me. And the lack of the viewfinder was starting to really frustrate me time to time on the GR3. So just like I did with my X-T2 and the X-T3, I had a lot of fun using this camera. I think it's kind of pointless talking about if you should buy this camera or not in 2019. You know, if you have the budget for it and you want to buy it, I think it's a great camera. And if you want to wait for the new one, you can do that as well. If you already have other small Fuji cameras like the X-T30 or X-T20, maybe you don't need it unless you really want to try the optical viewfinder. I feel like I'm just kind of rambling on at this point, so I'm just gonna end the video here. So yeah, the X100F, it's a great camera. I love it. Fuji has done it again, and I can't wait to try out the new ones when they come out. And if you're a street or travel photographer, and then if you haven't tried the X100F or any other Fuji cameras for that matter, I think you should give it a try. So that's gonna be it for me today, and thank you for watching as always, and thank you everyone who messaged me about the camera. It really means a lot to me that some people care about what I have to say about a camera and that my opinion matters. So thank you again, and always feel free to leave me any comments about the next cameras that you want me to test, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.